It was a spring afternoon. It turned into New Jersey Avenue from the White House. And as they did, Mrs. Lincoln said to him, she said, "You almost startle me with your cheerfulness." He said, "Mary, this is the happiest day of my life." There are some who think Lincoln was melancholy. Let's find out what he meant by happiness. No character is ever born great. Character becomes great. Some people's lives are flat and dull, and others have a tension and a pull. There are opposites in them, like the positive and negative poles of electricity. Moses, for example, was not always a meek man. He once killed an Egyptian. He had to become meek. John the Baptist was not always a loving man. He once asked the Lord to rain down fire from heaven upon the Samaritans. And so there was some great tension in Lincoln. And he became great because he was able to reconcile those opposites. Now, what were they? They were adversity and joy. And the two are not as opposed as it would seem. And it took a lifetime to reconcile them. First of all, adversity. He had to pay the penalty of success even as a young man. Someone has said that jealousy is the tribute which mediocrity pays to genius. They said that his simplicity was a pose, that he cultivated the manner of honesty, but that he really was not. He was slandered, for example, by his political opponent Cartwright, who called him an atheist, which he was not. And Lincoln asked his friends, he said, "Do not answer a charge." As silly as that. Many of his confreres called him the Illinois gorilla, the original baboon. Samuel B. Morse, who invented the telegraph, said that he was an illiterate without any brains. Congress at one time thought of impeaching him. He had to go before Congress once in order to defend his wife against the charge of being a spy. And after he gave the Gettysburg Address, the Chicago papers said, "The blood of every American will tingle with shame on reading the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of one who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as President of the United States." And then there were other adversities besides slander, great sorrow. When he was a young man, he fell in love with Anne Rutledge. He was only 18. She was in love, at least for a time, with a young man from the East who failed to correspond. Then Lincoln met her. She was beautiful as fresh as springtime. He asked her to marry him. They were engaged. She was taken ill, seriously. Lincoln was the only one that was allowed at her bedside. When she died, Lincoln said, "I cannot bear the thought of rain falling on her." And he used to go out and walk through the woods near the grave, muttering strange sounds, trying to recover a belief in immortality, because he had read some of Voltaire and Volney. He said one day to a friend, pointing to the grave of Anne Rutledge, "My heart is buried there." And yet, with all of that adversity, on the other side, there was something else. There was a joy. A superficial joy and a profound joy. Now, when we speak of joy, let it be understood that joy is not the same as pleasure. Pleasure belongs to the body, joy belongs to the mind. Pleasure changes with circumstances. For example, we are enjoying ourselves in one place or one condition and not in another. Joy, however, is rather constant. Pleasure changes with the years. We do not have the same kind of pleasures when we're old as when we're young. But joy remains always the same. Now, Lincoln had a joy, not a gaiety. It was superficial and profound. Superficial, first of all, and that manifested itself in a love of stories. I think that the incidents that he very often recounted were just a kind of a surface manifestation of something that was really very, very happy down deep in the inside, particularly as adversity increased. One day, Mrs. Lincoln came up to the room they left a White House reception. One of the boys was sick. She had a big long train on her dress, low-neck dress. Lincoln looked at her and said, "Cat has a long tail tonight, dear. Might help if some of the tail were cut off and wrapped around the head." When he was debating Douglas said, "My opponent has been a failure at everything. He was a failure behind a grocery store. He was a failure even in the forests. He was a failure even behind a bar because he sold drinks." And Lincoln said, "Yes, Douglas, and you were on the other side and not a failure in drinking them either." At one time someone said to him, "Mr. Lincoln, we've never heard you swear or blaspheme. Why is that?" Well, he said there was never any need of swearing as long as I had Stanton in the cabinet. Two women, it said, were discussing the relative merits of Jefferson and Lincoln. And one woman said, "You know, Jefferson was a praying man." And the other one, defending the president, said, "But Lincoln is a praying man." "Yes," she said, "I know, but the good Lord can never tell whether or not he's joking." Lincoln said that he never invented a story, that he did not have a wit. He said he was just a retailer of stories. And they got him out of many, many jams and difficulties. But all these things were superficial. Sometimes they illustrated even a domestic policy. He told about a red-haired mother who had 12 children. And he said that she would spank them and whip them and so forth, but she said to her neighbors, "You stay out of this. This is my quarrel, and we settle everything in this house." And Lincoln said, "We settle everything in the United States, and we want no one interfering in our business." But then came another kind of joy. It was the joy that comes from a good conscience, from honesty, humility, and above all, a great vocation. First of all, honest. Well, of course, everyone knows him. Honest Abe. A judge of the Supreme Court of Illinois said he never knew Lincoln to practice deception. On one occasion, his political opponent, or rather his opposing lawyer, in a trial, said to the jury, they call him Honest Abe. He's not honest. He's just clever. He wears a mask. He's an actor. Doesn't believe what he says. And Lincoln said, you have known me for many years. Is that true? And the lawyer bounded to his feet and said, no, it's a lie. And I take it back. One day he said to a client, he said, from the point of view of law, you have a case. From the point of view of equity and justice, you have none. He said, you know, if I took your case and I went before a jury, my conscience couldn't be in it, and I would be saying to myself all the time that I was talking, Abraham Lincoln, you're a liar. And he said, you know, I might even say it out loud. He was associated with another lawyer who charged the client $1,000. And Lincoln said to the client, you've been overcharged. I will charge you nothing. He would never take a case which his own conscience could not defend. And then, in addition to that deep-seated honesty, was a humility. Do you ever notice today how often people will contradict themselves and say, well, I'm very proud, and I say it in all humility. I've heard dozens of people receiving awards say that. Lincoln would never accept an award or an honorary chairmanship or anything that did not have some work behind it. And as regards his own conscience and his own humility, say he never cared where he slept, put down in the basement, put up in the garret. He hardly ever knew what he ate. When it was first proposed to him that he become candidate for president, he said, I'm not worthy to be a president of the United States. Had to be prevailed upon. He said his education was defective. One day a lawyer quoted Latin and said, you understand what that means, Mr. Lincoln? He said, if you're talking Latin, you'll have to ask someone else. Lincoln used to chop his own wood, and even in the White House. Shined his own shoes. And someone saw him one day shining his shoes in the White House, and he said, Mr. President, you shining your own shoes? Lincoln said, who else? And one day, or not one day, but on many occasions, he used to annoy Mrs. Lincoln considerably because he would always open the front door for the visitors. And one day Mrs. Lincoln reprimanded him. She said there was someone there to do that. And the lady was going out, said to Mrs. Lincoln, Mary, she said, if I had a husband like that, I wouldn't care what he did. The humility was real and genuine. And as the years went on, he began to see more and more that he owed everything to a power above him. And then allied with that was a sense of a vocation, which he received very early in life, and which never seemed to leave him. He went down the Mississippi as a young man, got off in New Orleans, walked around the French Quarter, Spanish Quarter, and then came to a slave market. He went in with John Hanks. There was the auctioneer standing on a cracker box. All about the room were slaves, stripped to the waist. Prospective buyers were going around, opening their mouths, looking at their teeth, judging them like they might judge a horse. Others forced the slaves to run around the room, see if they had good wind, if they were strong enough for slave labor. And others turned lecherous eyes on the women they bought. Lincoln saw husbands and wives being separated and children being torn from mothers. And he could stand it no longer. And he turned to John Hanks and he said, "Someday I'm going to hit that institution, and I'm going to hit it hard, by the eternal God." Backwoodsman. And illiterate. Talking about an institution that went back to 1437 when a Portuguese sold 10 slaves to someone in Portugal. And he, without any education, any background, was going to hit this institution. Why, a man who has a vocation like that is happy on the inside. And so the two, joy and adversity, went on through his life. And some biographers will take the joy and make him out to be a humorist, and others will take the adversity and make him out to be melancholic. No, if you see the depth of character, you see the two fusing, because the two are not inseparable. The two can coexist. It's well to remember, for example, that the only night that our blessed Lord ever sang was the night that he went out to his death. And the great discourse that he ever gave on joy, and it was the only time he ever spoke on joy, was the night that he went out to die. Paul and Silas sang in prison. There's such a thing as having joy before one, therefore being able to bear any kind of adversity. And that's the making of a great character. Any man who's been through any kind of suffering and borne up under it, and seen it come from the hand of God, he has a joy on the inside that no one can take away from him. And as time went on, it was joy that came out of this adversity and this vocation. So he had a presentiment of death, certainly. He did. He dreamed about it. He dreamt about it one night in Springfield in 1860. He was on a couch. He was looking at a mirror in the far end of the room. And he saw two faces. His own. First one, clear, lifelike. The second, dull and ghastly. He got up from his couch and walked up before the mirror. Two images vanished, came back again to his couch and looked. And there was the clear one, and there was the dull one. He went to Mrs. Lincoln and he said, "What does it mean?" She said, "I think it means that you will finish your first term, but you will die before the second." And then, 1865, night he was very quiet. Mrs. Lincoln said to him, "You seem troubled." "Yes." He said, "I've been troubled about a dream." And he said, "What is strange is that in the morning when I woke up, I took up the Bible and I turned it over. And every page that I turned was the page about a dream or a vision, beginning with the vision of Jacob and the angels ascending and descending the ladder. And she said, "What was the dream?" He said, "I went to bed rather sad. I was worried about reports from the front. And I fell asleep, and I was not asleep very long. When in my dream I got up and I went downstairs to the first floor of the White House. But everywhere I walked, I heard people moaning, crying, and weeping. I could see no one. I went from one room into another. Not a person was to be seen. But everywhere, like the roar of a sea, a moan and a cry was going up. I went into the East Room. And there in the East Room, I saw a coffin. Round about the coffin were soldiers. And I said, "Who's dead?" And the soldiers answered, "The President of the United States. He has been assassinated." That was my dream. And then we come to the scene that we described. The day that he and Mrs. Lincoln were out for a ride. And she said, "You're very cheerful." He said, "This is the happiest day of my life." It was Good Friday. Good Friday, the day on which our blessed Lord died to save sinners from the slavery of Satan. And she said, "You remember you felt joyful too, like that the day that Willie died. You seemed to be so joyful in adversity." And on that Good Friday night, the dream came true. And every great character must have a Judas, someone who betrays. And he fell by an assassin's bullet. And the assassin, as he jumped from the box of Lincoln, tripped on the American flag, on which many a tyrant has tripped since, and fell. And Lincoln, who would never openly quite, and asked for a list of the worthy poor. And I went to this particular alley. It was the wrong address, actually. I got into Rat Alley. And when the door opened, there, earthen floor, was a blind father at a stove. 10 children barefooted around the stove. A ladder leading up to the second floor. One bed upstairs, bed downstairs. The children slept crosswise. I asked the family what they had. This was Christmas Eve, what they had for dinner. She opened a bag of straw. Children had no sabots, no wooden shoes. I took care of them for 4 years while I was studying at the university. Got them jobs, rehabilitated them. I felt at times perhaps they were drawing on me. But do you know that the day that I went up for my examination as a professor at that university, I went in at 9 o'clock to face 200 professors. I saw the whole family coming down the street. I asked them where they had been. They said, for the last 2 days, we've been at a shrine praying for you that you would pass the examination. We walked all the way back. I was never lonesome again. That's the cure. Helping the neighbor. But here's something to remember, too. We think we should not be lonely. In this age of psychiatry, there are 2 or 3 conclusions that our world has drawn which are false. One is that we should never have attention. Certainly we have tensions. We must have them. We've got body and spirit, and they go in opposite directions. They have 2 different landing fields. Certain tensions are normal. If we didn't have them, we would be abnormal. And then we're lonesome. Sure. There's a metaphysical loneliness. Perfection is not here. This is not our home. I've got something that I want in my heart that nothing on this earth can satisfy, and nothing can satisfy you either. And we know it very well. So what's the cause of this loneliness? What are we looking for? Well, we say we're looking for God. Yes. Then I know what you will answer. What does God know about loneliness? Now that's a good question. That's a good question. What does he know about loneliness? Does he know anything about the loneliness, for example, of a babe in Afghanistan who has no better home than just straw? Does God know anything about the loneliness of a mother who has to gather up a child in order to escape a dictator and fly halfway across Africa? Does God know anything about the loneliness of a man that's born on the wrong side of the tracks? Who's isolated socially from people simply because his hands are calloused with common labor and is denied decent society? Sure, does God know anything about that kind of loneliness, for example, in which one is expelled from a city, disowned by one's own people? Does he know anything about the loneliness of being deserted by friends? Does he even know anything about the loneliness of feeling doubts? Doubts even about religion, doubts even which one cries out, "Why hast thou abandoned me?" Does God know anything about these things? Yes, those are good questions. Now suppose that there was a figure that came into all of this loneliness and so immersed himself in it that he would not immunize himself from it, would not cut himself off from it. Would you, for example, be the only one on the battlefield that was whole and not help any of the wounded? And so if there was a figure that came into this world of ours and refused to isolate himself from loneliness and felt it so much that blood poured out from his body, felt loneliness so much that as if all the robberies of the world were thrust into his hands, as if he himself were guilty, that felt all loathsome carnality so much that his flesh was hanging from him like purple rags. Suppose someone came into this world and went into all of this loneliness, took it all, and was not overcome by it, but conquered it all. Then what? Then I may be lonely every now and then, but I'll not be overcome by it, then I have a captain, kind of a captain who yet presses not a button in heaven from a celestial command. But I have a captain who stumbled to a throne.
The vast white beauty of the season of winter reaches gracefully toward the sleeping mountains, and there, in the beauty of its flowing crystal sculptures, we miss seeing the simple presence of color. Even our warm, wild creatures know it's not easy finding green under a blanket of snow, but it's nice to have a friend to help you look. Bishop Sheen tells us to love is to be happy, and happiness is like a rainbow, shining in the light of the first morning, soaring like a bird in praise of the new dawn.
So this story, the portrait of Dorian Gray, is a kind of an autobiography. This handsome youth has his portrait painted. And in that painting, he stands in all of his promise, handsomeness, virility, gaiety, and gladness. A portrait normally has timelessness about it. Our portrait is painted at a certain age, and that's the age the portrait remains. But in this story of Oscar Wilde, it's the portrait that grows old, and it's Dorian Gray, the young man who remains young. So that as he lives his life of pleasure, starting with the feast, he never changes. He's always the aesthetically beautiful and lovely. But that portrait, week by week, month by month, year by year, it ages, wrinkles, becomes senile. All of the remonstrances of conscience, all of the inspirations of the spirit that he spurned, all of the evil that he did, and all of its excesses seem to be drawn each day, as if some invisible brush were painting over that portrait. This was the real Dorian Gray. At the end, he had nothing. He saw what he was, and he couldn't stand it any longer. And he takes a knife to plunge it into that portrait. Servants come in sometime later. They see hanging on the wall the portrait of a handsome, young, promising youth. And at the bottom of the portrait, Dorian Gray with a knife in his heart. He had started with a light instead of the raindrop. So in answer to the gloomy dramatists and novelists who call the garbage pail and the excesses of life reality, may we say that they have a point, but they've exaggerated it. There's both in life, and that's what makes it wonderful and great. Just as in weaving, there's a warp and a woof. There is a line of sadness, and there's also a line of gladness. There's the horizontal stitch, and there's the vertical stitch. And the makers of these great tapestries, like the Gobelin tapestry, never work from the front, as maybe you do your needlework. They have before them just the image, the portrait, of what they want to portray, but they work from the back of the tapestry, not from the front. And they weave one thread after another. The tool, the light, the raindrops. And finally, when it's all finished, then they look at what they've done. They started behind where they could not quite understand the mystery, but they finished by understand the fullness of light. Cab put it well, describing that manner in which these tapestries are made. My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I may but choose the colors. He worketh skillfully. For oft he chooses sorrow, and I, in foolish pride, forget he sees the upper, and I, the underside. So the true philosophy of life then becomes Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Unless there's the Good Friday in life, there will never be the Easter Sunday. Unless there is the cross, there will never be the empty tomb. And when I look at the sky, I see exactly the same lesson taught. Happiness is a rainbow.
Like our season of spring, when the water sprays of a beautiful fountain reach into the new sunlight, toward the visions of hope in the new life of spring. And in the bright light of our soaring dreams, we will fly toward the celebration of 1,000 dawns.
How often an adult will have an inexpressible love for a sweet child. It's unreciprocated. They do not know they're loved. And Mrs. Thompson's pain. She went her unrepentant way. She went and left with me the pang of all the partings gone, and the partings yet to be. She left me marveling why my soul was sad, that she was glad. Had all the sadness in the sweet, and the sweetness in the sad. And then he ends. Nothing begins, nothing ends. It is not paid with moan, for we are born in others' pain and perish in our own. The love went out from his life. But then he found some solace in little Olivia Meynell. Sweet little child, but here was his life spoiled. And with the pillaring hours about to crush him, he seemed afraid of this beautiful innocence. And he wrote, I fear to love thee, sweet, because love's the ambassador of loss. Love's the ambassador of loss. White flake of childhood, clinging so to my soiled raiment, thy shy snow at tenderest touch will shrink and go. Love me not, delightful child, my heart, by man's snares beguiled, has grown timorous and wild. It would fear thee not at all, wert thou not so harmless, small, because thy arrows, not yet dire, are still unbarbed with destined fire. I fear thee more than hadst thou stood for panoplied in womanhood. And all the while, he's being haunted by something. And I told you of that poem of haunting. I gave it to you one year, The Hound of Heaven, that he wrote. He went back again to dope. The Meynell still cared for him. This hound was pursuing him. But despite this shell, that shell that first came to the Meynells, he had no stockings on and his toes were out through his shoes and dirty old brown coat, no shirt. Consumptive, because of the nights he slept under the cart wheels of London. He still had this love that pulled him. Probably that was pulling him at the beginning of his life, and so he wrote, "O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we love thee. Turn but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your estranged faces that miss the many splendored thing. Love's the many splendored thing, not earth love, heaven love, that Thompson saw everywhere." And haunted by that love, he went finally to his reward. And one day, well, in London, I went out to Kensal Green Cemetery. And I asked someone whom I had met in the cemetery, "Do you know where the tomb or the grave of Francis Thompson is?" No, I never heard of him. So I walked and walked. And I finally came to a slab that read, Francis Thompson, 1859, 1907. And then there came a line, an unforgettable line that drew one back to all of his loves of childhood. And that last line on the tombstone was, "Look for me in the nurseries of heaven." Love's a many splendor thing.
In summer, God warms the earth and paints a tapestry of colors to give our journey, where we are going, more joy. From the Bible, we remember other journeys by two men, Peter and Paul. They walked on these ancient gray stones called the Appian Way, the road to Rome. Quo vadis, Peter? Quo vadis, Paul? Whither goest thou?
And I'm going to describe three characteristics. The first characteristic of the new violence of our day is what we will call elitism. Now, this word, I don't know whether it exists or not, but it's the only way that I can describe it. It's taken from the word elite. There used to be a virtuous elite, a core of heroes and saints that very much influenced any culture and democracy. The new elite practices what is called elitism. Namely, there is a dominant minority that makes a lot of noise and that uses violence to force its will upon others. They're revolutionists without a program. They have no flag. They only know what they're against. Did you not know what they're for? And taking some words out of Toynbee, they're made up of two groups. Toynbee said the first group was conqueror. I would call one of the groups the man with the bullhorn. He's always the leader. You just watch in any violent group today that follows the principle of Saint-Just, what's the man with the bullhorn? He's the leader of that revolt. Secondly, there are the hangmen, the kind that will rifle desks, destroy property, burn homes, do anything to enforce their will. And then there are the wastrels, the group that just profit from violence, confiscate property to be in on the violence. That's the first group. Second, mysticism. This is another new characteristic of the revolution. Mysticism is a term that belongs to religion. It doesn't belong, actually, in the field of politics, but has been transposed to politics. Now, what was mysticism? Mysticism was it could best be expressed in the mysticism of John of the Cross. Todo y nada. In other words, God or nothing. Now, you give yourself to God completely, or else you give nothing. This was spiritual mysticism. Now, political mysticism is, of course, there is no God. It's my will or nothing. This is what the elite insists upon. No alternative, no compromise. Thirdly, this is not my term. You could very well accuse me of having invented it. I've often thought of giving a telecast on it, but the other day I went into the 10-volume history of Toynbee. And lo and behold, I found Toynbee as saying that idea which has been in my mind, namely Satanism. Satanism is behind it too. This is the third characteristic of it. The world is built on order. There's a plan, so scientists are able to discover the laws of the universe. And in discovering the laws of the universe, men find harmony. This harmony and order had to come from somewhere. It came from God. In the book of Genesis, we read, "And in the days of Noah, there was violence on the earth." All of the violence that happens in our country is a fever graph. Read it. I tell you one thing that we have to do. We have to realize maybe why the eagle is our national symbol. The eagle always builds its nest high in the mountain crevices. When the young are hatched, the eagle pushes its young over the nest. And they fly down to what to eaglet eyes must seem like sudden death. And just before the young eagle crashes, the mother eagle swoops down from its nest, down to the abyss, and catches the young, and then flies up into the sky, swoops from out it again, and repeats the process until the bird has learned to fly. Moses saw that, and he wrote, "As the eagle stirs among the young, so does God stir among the nations." Maybe God is stirring us, bringing us to the brink of danger, in order that we might begin to examine ourselves and restore Jefferson, the dignity of man, and a belief in God. Our nation is too full of those that are crying down. Down with the universities. Down with schools.
Down with the churches. Down with teachers. Down with government.